Today's topic is titled the Improving the Shameful Treatment of the First Nations People is vital to Australia's well-being. Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that the importance of this topic cannot be overstated. And to speak on this, we have two wonderful speakers with us. They are Jason D. Santolo and Paddy Gibson, both from UTS here in Sydney. Let me quickly introduce the two speakers, and then we can welcome them both the usual way. Jason will be speaking first, and Jason D. Santolo is a senior researcher with the Jambuna Indigenous House of Learning at UTS. He is a descendant of Garawa and Barangam peoples. Over the past 15 years, he has been exploring collaborative research and media practices for communicating sustainable autonomy with a focus on video and new media. Jason is currently heading the Jambuna Research New Media. Now, the second speaker, Paddy Gibson, is also a senior researcher with the Jambuna Indigenous House of Learning at UTS. Paddy has lived in Alice Springs and traveled extensively in Central Australia, researching the impact of the NT intervention. He is also an organizer with the Stop the Intervention Collective Sydney and co-editor of Solidarity magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jason and Paddy the usual way. May I now invite Jason to the microphone.
Hello everyone, it's really nice to be here. Thank you to the organisers. I'm really excited to be speaking. Politics in the Pub is super famous and it's a real honour to be here, and thank you very much for having me. My name's Jason de Santolo. My family name is Daylight, and I'm Garawa and Barangam. My people are from the southwest Gulf of the Northern Territory and southeast Queensland. I was born in Darwin, and just after the cyclone, my adopted family took me to Aotearoa, New Zealand, so I kind of grew up there within a treaty context. And then I came back in the middle of my law degree and realised that there's a lot of work to be done in Australia in terms of the well-being of everyone and the well-being of the land, and especially the well-being of our people in the Gulf country and Northern Territory, but everywhere in Australia. And I guess today I wanted to just offer some comments in regards to the notion of two laws and the notion of renewal. I don't know if many of you have seen an amazing documentary which was made by Alessandro Cavadini and Carolyn Strocklin between 79 and 81 in Borroloola in the southwest Gulf of Northern Territory, and explored the notion of two laws. And in that documentary, it tracked the history of colonisation and the impacts of invasion. It tracked the slavery that happened. It tracked the murder, and it reenacted a lot of these things on film. And at the very base of the documentary, it talked about the concept of having two laws on Garawa country. It has Aboriginal law and Australian law. And I guess I wanted to talk about that concept of two laws because I think those two laws have a vastly different approach to the idea of well-being. Australian law was enacted here from the very beginning as part of a colonial project. And we all know the colonial project was about extraction of resources, the commodification of land, the commodification of people. Whereas Aboriginal law is about interrelationships. It's about relating to each other. It's about relating to the natural world. It's about renewal. And renewal is about maintaining the conditions for the life, basically. And renewal is a big part of an Aboriginal paradigm or an Indigenous paradigm. And in effect, it says that all of our ceremonies, all of our cultural practices, one of the key aspects of that is renewal. And it's about being in touch with the natural cycles of life. The patterns that are in nature is what we do when we reenact our ceremonies. And if you know, it's very popular these days, like the song lines, it's everywhere. We're talking about song lines, they're projected onto the opera house, they're on TV and things. And these song lines are a really important part of Aboriginal law as well. So if you imagine a vast territory, there's song lines that travel through the territory and they map the land. And they map the land through stories and sacred sites and ceremonies. And so song lines, the word for song lines, one of the song lines in Up Home is Gudjiga. Now Gudjiga is a very, very sacred and important song line because it is the manifestation of our authority over the land. It is a manifestation of our law. So if we went to court and we wanted to assert our authority over our land, we would sing our Gudjiga. We wouldn't hold a bit of paper up and say, this is the title to the land, this, like you would in Australian law. We would, our song men and our elders, they would have the boomerangs and they would sing that Gudjiga and they say, that is how we relate to the land. So embedded into these song traditions is our canons of law. And our canons of law are not about commodification of land. They're not about commodification of people. They're not about destruction. They're about renewal. They're about looking after each other and relating to everything. And I think it's a really exciting point when we're in a point in Australia, I guess, where there's talk about treaty again. And for many of us, it's about sovereignty. So a lot of our nations and clans and a lot of our movements are saying, well, we're fighting for our sovereignty. And the only way that we can reclaim our sovereignty or have our sovereignty enacted is through a treaty. And a treaty is between two nations, two sovereign nations. It's a Western tool of colonization, really. So I'm curious about posing that question, and I'd really love some feedback tonight about what we think. If we're saying, if there are two laws, and many laws, if there are many laws in this country, but if on Garawa country, if there's two laws, and if we're going to move into treaty making and negotiating, and sovereignty doesn't exist on a bit of paper, it doesn't exist in a Western rights framework, but it exists in a very complex and sophisticated legal framework, which is about interrelationship, it's about renewal, it's about protecting the land, it's about songlines. Then how are we going to negotiate a treaty that's going to be effective? That's why I'm a little bit worried about when we look to a treaty as something that will bring well-being to the Australian nation. Because I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I've worked in the treaty industry. So the treaty was signed in 1840. I think most people know that there were a number of treaties in New Zealand, and there's treaties all over the world. I don't really know of an example of a treaty with Indigenous peoples that's been honoured. What I worry about is if I talk to my elders about signing a treaty, how are we going to enforce that treaty the next day? When they come in and try to mine our lands and we say, no, you signed a treaty. You recognised our sovereignty and our authority over the land. And then when the mining companies come in and they start to mine our lands and we try to enforce that treaty against a huge, oppressive, violent state, which is the Australian state, which is stealing our kids, it's destroying the land, treating all our young people, our old people, terribly. How are we going to enforce that treaty? And I guess that's one of my concerns. So one of the things that we've been talking about up home is the idea of maximum autonomy. And that idea is about working together. It's about living in a society where we look after each other, where we look after the land, where we look to the mountain, to use a word that one of my favorite scholars use. His name is Gregory Kayete. And he says, one of the most important things about knowledge, he says, all human knowledge comes from a creative journey. And one of the phrases he uses is, look to the mountain. We look to the mountain. So we are standing here in the past and we climb the mountain. We toil, we struggle, we fight for our rights, and we climb to the top of the mountain. And when we get to the top of the mountain, we have whatever, our treaty, had some exercise, whatever. You get to the top of the mountain and then you're in the present and you think, oh, now I can see the vast future. So when we look to the mountain in Australia, what are we doing exactly? Are we moving into a space where we're just using default Western rights frameworks which don't really work, which are about individual rights to freedom, which are about individual rights to self-determination? Or are we going to start honouring and trying to understand some of the depth and the complexity of those two laws and how they can work together? And how by honouring and building those two laws, we can start to understand and develop mechanisms and systems that are around looking after the land and maintaining the conditions for life. And I think one of the things that that our young people, when you see them the most happiest, is when they're dancing and when they're singing and when they're doing those cultural practices which embody and connect us to each other and to the land. And those sort of things are also about hunting and other things. You know, those cultural practices exist in all of our grandparents and our great-grandparents. Gardening out the back, you know, growing our own food, walking to work and riding to work instead of driving a car, which is all about fossil fuels and multinationals and things. So I thought, today I'd really like to just pose that question and really ask and us to really look deep within ourselves and think, well, what are those things that make me feel really good, which are about renewal, which maintain those connections to each other, and which maintain those healthy ways in the community, and which maintain that vision when you're on top of the mountain, so that the young people, when they get to the top of the mountain, they can see the horizon and they can take up the challenge of looking after each other and creating a much more healthier society for everyone in the future. Yeah, and I think I'll end it there, keep it short and sweet. Thanks.